Hello and welcome everyone to the Gen Z podcast, where we give you a bit of information of a topic, a bit of perspective on a topic, and mainly just talk about our feelings. Today, you are joined by me, CJ, along with my co hosts.
Sam, hi. I'm by myself in Jen's studio tonight.
As well as.
Hi, I'm Brayden. I'm coming to y'all from beautiful Wisconsin.
And today, we are talking about the somewhat controversial topic of child labor. So, to preface what spurred this conversation tonight was about 2 weeks ago, the Iowa Senate passed a law that would expand or repeal essentially child labor protections. What it did is it made it so you could be working at meat packaging plants as well as assembly lines and roofing companies for people that were 16 and 17, while also making it easier for children that were 15 and 14 to work longer hours into the night. The main issue with this bill and this was passed along party lines by the GOP. The main issue or objections to this bill were said by the Dems. We're talking about the dangers of these professions that we are putting our young children and teens into, as well as not giving them any additional compensation or protections. This is different from another job that would be safer because there's absolutely a time and place for that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But that was the main issue. Another bit of recent news stories that have happened within the past few weeks is most recently there was a case. Now, granted, McDonald's did release a statement saying that they were not for this, and McDonald's is a franchise company, so they're not necessarily responsible for every single practice that does happen. But there was a case of multiple different children that were working at their facilities, including the most extreme example, which was a 10-year-old operating a fryer at 2 a.m. in the morning, which is, again, a bit further than would be deemed acceptable, not only in the case of Morley, but within the realms of the law. A few months ago, back in March, there was also an incident where Tyson, the chicken company, was found employing many migrant children within their plants and facilities, not doing any background checks on them, kind of having a don't ask, don't tell philosophy when it came to hiring these children. And so instead of getting schooling and education through our systems, they were instead working to try to make a living in destitute positions in a very, very dangerous industry. So those were the main topics that we had today. We have a bit of statistics on child labor, as well as like the likelihood of injury, especially in more dangerous jobs, and that can be brought up by Braden.
Yeah, so according to national bureaus on labor and according to nonprofit groups that like to study and track child labor, in the United States of America, we don't know for sure how many kids are employed underage in dangerous conditions because obviously, if you're an employer, you don't want to publicize that, you don't want to give that information away. But we are able to track information on injuries, and they're horrifying. What we found is that every year in the United States, around 200,000 injuries are sustained by child laborers on the job, so kids working in dangerous conditions. And even worse than that, in the United States, which, need I remind you, is the wealthiest, most developed nation in the history of the world, depending on how you look at it, around 70 kids die each year on the job working in these dangerous conditions. Now, it's not like they go to work and they already have a health condition and something happens. It's that they are put in these conditions that are deadly, that are fatal, and consequences, there are actions to that consequence, and these kids are losing their lives. Once again, that's around 70 per year.
And then to broaden that out a little bit more, Sam, you had some data and information on child labor statistics as a whole, as well as a few breakdown observations.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And thanks to some research that Braden did from the Wisconsin Public Radio that found that there are some companies, this particularly in the meat processing industry, that are committing some of the most egregious violations of child labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the main law in the federally that governs child labor, it was enacted in 1938 during the New Deal as a way to address the ongoing problem of child workers being exploited in the United States prior to that. The overall labor movement really fought for the rights of children to be able to attend school and not have to be out in the mines at the time. And but here we are in 2023, and some large companies, particularly one known as Packer Sanitation Services, Inc., just was ordered by the U.S. District Court of Nebraska to pay a $1.5 million fine to rectify the fact that they were employing well over 100 minors between the ages of 13 and 17 in some of their meat processing plants in Minnesota and Nebraska, so that fine came out to about $15,000 per employee as a fine. And my question, I suppose, would be, is that fine, if it's coming out to a $15,000 per kid fine, like, does that money go back to the kids or their families as some sort of restitution for the exploitation? I'm not really sure. But they were being hired to clean a lot of this meat processing equipment in low visibility conditions, working around toxic chemicals, doing jobs that, are far beyond what we would imagine teenagers would be doing as a part-time way to earn some extra money. These are really kind of dangerous jobs that should require that, in an ideal world, would not only require professionals who are working, but ideally with union protections as well. Obviously, none of that is going on here. And some of the records from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration find that this company has particularly spotty record when it comes to employee safety. Just in some of the past several years, there's been 4 amputations and 3 deaths at some of their meat processing plants, including a decapitation by a machine that was turned on while the employee was inside fixing it. There was another incident of a corkscrew mixing conveyor that amputated a worker's finger while he was removing a blockage, and a nitrogen leak in a poultry processing plant in Georgia that killed 6 workers. And basically saying that this company that employs about 17,000 employees nationwide across the meat processing plants, that's a pretty low volume, I suppose, for that industry, they're saying, of staff, and that compared to their industry competitors, it's a very, very high number of serious injury reports. So clearly you have certain repeat offenders. And, like I was saying about the jobs that the kids were being ordered to do, I think it's indicative of a larger issue of the kids, particularly most of these kids are migrant children, often being sent by themselves from countries in Central America and elsewhere, away from their families will send them to the United States with the purpose of earning some money to send them money back and hopefully get the rest of the family to be able to follow them eventually to the United States. And what that ends up happening is that the kids barely, if ever, get enrolled in public school. There's no accountability. They'll often be sent to family members that they've never met, or some of these illegal smugglers who will promise to take care of them, but ultimately end up never. Sometimes these kids never end up hearing from again, and so that's the largest demographic that's being exploited under these conditions, and they're the ones who have the least ability to be heard from by our media, by the public, because they have very few ties in this country of anybody looking out for them, and many of them may not even speak English. So it's a very, very difficult situation for the Department of Labor or for OSHA to be able to investigate, because who are they going to talk to? The employers. The employers are going to be the ones who speak to them. So I find that very troubling.
Okay. Yeah. And the thing that I also want to say when we're talking on this is that it's not on this podcast, we're not trying to say, hey, all child labor within the context of teenagers working is something that is particularly bad. within the state of Iowa, there was polling that was conducted, and the opinions on whether or not teenagers should be able to work, period, was in the difference of 50-50. The main issue that we have when we're talking about the grievance of this is more so, one, the groups that it tends to exploit, which we'll go into a little bit more data in a moment, of different ethnicities, as well as, I don't believe we have income levels, but different ethnicities and who is working those types of jobs, as well as the dangers that are being worked without those productions. For example, here in Florida, it is very popular for you to be working at Publix. And Sam, if you want to talk a little bit more on kind of the difference of trying to apply to Publix and experience of colleagues and from their experience working there versus then going back to our work within these much more dangerous jobs.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mentioned that in our meeting, but I think that, yeah, there's a huge difference between the jobs that are typical for American children to be working when they're in high school or in the summertime. You know, there's a certain category of jobs that I think we've deemed it's acceptable for minors to be able to get some work experience, be able to earn some money for themselves, to save up for a car or college or whatever they're worried about. And I think that's a very different category of labor than some of these extremely toxic, intensive, and dangerous jobs that are actually happening. So, you know,
did you want to share the statistics that you had across ethnicities that we talked about?
Yeah. So there's let me see here. Well, it says that, okay, the Department of Labor says that there's 21 million 16 to 24-year-olds in the United States who are employed. So that's about 55% of the 16 to 24-year-olds just in general in the country that are, employed in the labor participation rate in some way. And it had dipped a bit during the pandemic and then was sort of rebounding. And they typically find that the peak month of the year for that demographic's employment is July, because it's most common for kids to take those jobs in the summer, more common than in the school year, and to be working more in the summer. So that's fine. And most of those jobs, I would say, are above board. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. I mean, like I was giving the example of Publix, because here in Florida, I think that's a very common thing if you grow up here. Publix is one of the few large employers in Florida that will hire kids as young as 14 to work there, stocking shelves or bagging groceries or working.
Yes, this is a grocery supermarket for those who are
not. Yeah. For those who might not be in Florida, this is a very
so like a Safeway, Trader Joe's, but a little bit nicer, a private company, and they have stock options for employees.
Yeah, they are known in Florida as actually a very solid company to work for, because you can get stock options. They will often have a lot of opportunities for internal promotion, and it's very common for high school kids to get jobs at Publix because of that reason. And they pay better than some. So that's one thing. And I think that's what like most American kids would think of as that's the job to get, either that or, there's a number of other jobs they can do.
But earlier you're talking on percentages between.
Yeah. So there's a huge disparity within like the different demographics of legal work just for youth in the United States. It was saying like, okay, well, for example, in July 2022, 24% of employed 16 to 24-year-olds worked in the leisure and hospitality industry. Another 19% worked in the retail trade industry, 12% in education and health services. So, those are going to be mostly like restaurant jobs at the mall, retail jobs, education and health services. I guess that could be like tutoring or working at a community center or things like that. Those, again, I think are acceptable. And as long as they're, working in reasonable hours and being paid properly, that's fine for some experience for kids. But of course, even among those jobs, there is a large disparity of, who's really forced to get a job when they're still in school. And I'll pull up those statistics here. Give me 1 second.
And so to bring things back, and Brendan, you're welcome to chime in here, is that when we're looking at teenagers, more specifically on that 14 to 16 range, these are children that are working longer hours, and when they're having to work these jobs in order to try to help with these conditions, what ends up happening is you have to sacrifice something. You can sacrifice doing homework and school performance and academic performance, which is going to make it harder to get a better education going forward. You can sacrifice, your sleep or social status, which will allow you to be, more isolated from your friends or make it a harder time being able to socially adjust. If you are working just in general, again, for many, many hours, then you are going to be a little bit more stressed because you're going to be needing to still deal with other people while not quite having all of your mental capacities up, because you are, still someone who is growing up and still learning as you're going through hormones and brains. And do you want to talk anything on that end?
Yeah, so something that I was thinking as you were talking, as you were describing, often the sacrifices that these kids have to make and which kids actually have to take these dangerous long-hour jobs. This sounds a lot like human trafficking. I mean, hypothetically, hopefully, nobody's putting a gun to these kids' heads and saying, go work at that restaurant until 4 a.m., go work in that meat plant. But these kids are in conditions that are not suitable for them by any sense of the imagination. And a lot of times they are lied to get into these jobs. So when recruiters are trying to get, say, 14-year-olds to go work in a factory at night, they're not going to say, oh, well, this job's very dangerous. People do get amputated. People get stabbed with whatever machinery all the time. So, in a sense, a lot of these kids are manipulated into these jobs, and it's because, frankly, they have no choice. So, it's not human trafficking like we think, that type of slavery, but in a way, it almost is wage slavery because these kids are forced to make a dilemma. It's either they work in these jobs or their family doesn't eat, or they don't eat, or they don't afford survival. So, really, what is the difference between this and what we would think of as child trafficking, other than this is a less extreme, slightly more voluntary form of that?
So I want to, I did find the statistics I was mentioning before to you all. And the reason that they sounded so strange to me, I now realize, is because they were from 1880 on child labor. And so that's why I was like, there's no way that these numbers are correct, but they were in 1880. And so which is the first census that there was actually national statistics on child labor ever taken in the United States. So that's why they could go back. But this article is extremely interesting in sort of contextualizing how, the country really was founded on child labor in many ways. And it's, just to sort of summarize a little bit of it, it says in the colonial period and into the 1800s, parents and guardians generally required children to work. Initially, most of the population worked in agriculture, and children gradually moved into tasks demanding greater strength and skills as they aged. Going on a little bit more, it says, like, at every life cycle stage, farm-owning families in the Midwest, for example, earned approximately 30% of their gross farm revenue from growing cereal crops, 29% from dairy poultry market, 22% from land capital improvements, 15% from hay and livestock. Child labor added to that value tremendously, saying that children under 7 reduced the value of the farm output, presumably because they reduced their mother's economic activities. But for children ages 7 to 12, the family's output increased about $16 per year. So it's to say that they relied, which I guess at the time was a lot of money. So okay.
So I, thank you for the history lesson part. To bring up a little bit of modern data, just going back of the past 5 years. This is off of the Department of Labor information. We had In 2019, 858 cases with child labor violations. Then in 2020, it did go down slightly to 851. Then 2021 is 747. And then in 2022, 835. And to have that amount of child labor violations with the amount of child laborers going from 3,000 roughly in 2019, 3,300 in 2020, 2,800 in 2021, and 3,800 in 2022, to have the amount of, again, violations and breaking the law is something of concern. But the other part, again, when we're talking about concern here, is trying to loosen the child labor protections and the laws that have been being repealed and the effects that it then has. I was fortunate enough to not need to work when I was in high school. Instead, I was able to participate in sports, and that sports had me basically in the pool. I was a swimmer and water polo player, but I was swimming at 6:20 a.m. and I would be at school for the most of the day. I'd then have 2 hours to go home before going back to practice and finishing up at 6:30 p.m. every single day, Monday through Friday. And that was really great, informative in terms of me being able to work on a team and being able to be in great physical shape. And by, again, having these longer hours or having looser restrictions without having additional compensation, that is something where we're starting to run into a little bit of more concern and more danger. Again, working a certain amount of hours. And earlier in our pre-talk today, we were talking about how a certain state had expanded from 30 hours to, I believe it's 35 hours.
New Hampshire. Yeah. If you want me to say that. So
Yes.
New Hampshire's governor signed a law recently that he did some changes to the labor codes in New Hampshire that basically allow for bussers as young as 14 years old to clear tables where liquor is served. Okay. I mean, if they're already working at it, to me, that's not very egregious. Like, that just kind of seems like another part of the job. Expands but he also, what I found more surprising was that he expanded in that same bill the number of hours that 16 and 17-year-olds can work during the school year from 30 hours a week to 35 hours a week. And that number completely just blew me away. Because to think that it was even 30 before, but now it's 35. You know, when you're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds, those are kids that are in high school, which means that they're in school, you know, presumably 8 hours a day, or, you know, and then whatever other commitments they might have plus homework. And then to think that they're like allowed legally to also work up to 35 hours a week in a job just doesn't even seem like it would be physically possible because of to me, like the timing of it. I don't know when those hours would get put in if they're at school all day. That's almost a full-time job. And so the fact that he voted, you know, to expand that is deeply troubling, but also reflective, I guess, of how pervasive the labor shortage is in the country right now, that like employers are having to turn to high school kids to fill some of these spots, which I do buy that because I know that many industries are struggling to find workers.
Well, that's something
I don't think
also
this is the answer.
would love to, you know, chime in on, and Braden, I really want to hear your opinions on this too. Is it does feel like, hey, there is a hiring shortage despite the amount of job growth continuing to go up with every single report that we've had quarterly. But the other part is like, would you flip burgers for $100,000 a year? Answer yes or no.
Hell yeah, for $100,000. I'd do a lot worse.
Would
That
you
sounded
flip
really bad
burgers
in
for
mind.
$50,000 a year?
You know,
That's
maybe
a
if I
solid
was
way.
desperate.
But the thing with that, in bringing that up, just as an example, is that it's not necessarily the labor that is being the issue. The issue is with the payment of how much work compared to how much payment that there is. To bring up a personal example of me, I was able to work at Twisty Treat, which is a fantastic ice cream place. The hours were a little bit fluctuating, but I was able to work there, and I was getting paid the same hourly rate as one of my friends at the time, who was working at a plant nursery in the Florida heat under grueling hours. So she was able to get more hours, so that I'll give her that in terms of the difference. But we were both getting the same income, and again, it's does really feel like, at least to me, when we are seeing these pressure, coming out of seemingly nowhere. Um, with trying to make it easier for other people to work, it is due to, again, trying to say, oh, well, we've squeezed out, enough work from these people. Well, we need to expand our pool more and more. Even though migration also is great for expanding your pool of employers, as well as, again, just increasing your wages does do a large quantity of that, even if it does potentially cut into profits. Which, by the way, with the prices going up as much as they have, does bring the the rate that you're paying your employees down, also compared to other factors. But
Yeah,
Braden,
we've had
anything on that?
year after year after year of record high corporate profits. And you know what? If you're willing to hire a 13-year-old to work in a condition that could potentially take an arm, take a limb, or even take their whole life, you can afford to raise your wages so that you don't have to be in that position to hire kids in the first place. Or better yet, you can afford to create safer conditions and a better workplace for your workers so that people actually want to go and be employed there. Now, you know what? If some CEO, God forbid, poor them, has to only get a $1 million raise each year instead of $4 million, I mean, poor them. We'll say our prayers for them. But, you can afford to pay your damn workers.
And to not necessarily strawman this, and I do want to go back to the Iowa Senate bill. It is not 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds that are necessarily working on those dangerous jobs. It is putting 15, 16, and 17-year-olds within the dangerous jobs of assembly plant working.
Oh, they are also working as young at that age too. I mean,
yes, but that part is technically illegal. But
yeah, I'm referring to the Wisconsin case, which was obviously illegal.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
where I want to split the conversation is that there is the talking of one greatly for, because how can we change it? And what I'm talking about we as citizens and lawmakers. It's like, what can we do? Well, one, the least that we can do is not be repealing the current safeties that we have. And if we are going to be repealing the safeties, at least have it be at massive compensation. If you are someone that is working at 14, 15, 16 because you were either going on your own and left the school early, or because your family is desperate, then I feel like having an increased minimum wage at the very least for those types of jobs should be good. I do think it's also still reasonable to have restrictions on youth working when it comes to either overnight or the jobs and professions that are working, which again was the place and was the law and still is the law in many areas. But again, in Iowa is on its track to be repealed. And then the last part with that is to address the illegal portions of that. The cost of a fine is the cost of doing business. It is something that is kind of put into the business model. Oh, well, if it's going to cost me this amount, that amount, then I'm going to be okay with that. I can go into a case where it's the Ford motor vehicles, and there was actually a reason why we have a minimum amount of cost for human life, but this is much more of a consumer case, and that goes to there was a Ford Pinto model. It was a model of vehicle that had their gas in the trunk, so if you rear-ended the trunk, the car would explode. Ford realized this, but instead of issuing a recall, they figured that the cost of the lawsuits would be less than the cost of recalling all the cars and putting it properly underneath the vehicle. And so it led to the deaths of thousands of people. Then there was a great, class action lawsuit, but you cannot replace the loss of human life. So to bring things back to this, it's trying to lobby, trying to call for, either harsher fines, harsher restrictions, or taking away the ability to operate your business and being shut down completely. I feel like being able to revoke licenses would be something that'd be a much stronger message, or at the very least having massive amounts of compensation for every single infraction blown to be able to increase the chance of whistleblowers at all be effective. Or of course, increasing just unionization within the areas, which Sam, if you want to talk a little bit more on that in a bit.
Well, I could do a lot on the labor stuff, but I do want to just highlight, because we talked about the kids who are, so the Department of Labor does estimate that there are about 1 to 2 million children across the United States who are working illegally in some of these jobs. And what the New York Times revealed in a deep dive that they did recently was that there's an entire shadow workforce of mostly migrant children across industries in every state. And just for some examples, 12-year-olds working as roofers in Florida and Tennessee, 13-year-old girls washing hotel sheets in Virginia, 13-year-old boy in Michigan making auto parts on an overnight shift that went till 6:30 in the morning, 12-year-olds working for Hyundai subsidiaries in Alabama. All of these products that might say that they're made in the United States, which might make you think, oh, okay, they're not made in a third world country in a sweatshop because that's why we pay more for them. And then come to find out that, even here in the United States, they're using child labor and kids that are, for the large part, have no ability to advocate for themselves, because of the fact that they're 12 and 13 years old. So they just might not even have the vocabulary to advocate for themselves, but also largely because they might be undocumented, they're far away from their families, and in many cases they don't even speak English. So how is a child in that position who's being forced into this position or risk deportation or some negative legal outcome, if the Department of Labor, and I know we went back to those statistics that said like there was 3,800 violations in 2022 or something like that. That just goes to show to me how underreported the problem is. Because if there's only 3,800 violations being reported to the Department of Labor in an entire year in a country of 300 something million people, that tells you that there's thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more cases that are not being reported. And a lot of these jobs are not places that most of the public would be familiar with. So, if it's meat processing plants, agriculture, out in fields in rural areas, these are places that like most of us on a day-to-day basis are never really encountering. So it's not like you're going to know if these kids are out there working. And the employers rely on that. They know that. I think the majority of the public is kind of blind to this and doesn't really want to know. And, these laws are quietly getting passed, like you talked about in Iowa, where some of the most archaic laws that they just passed, they do them in the quiet of the night. Like the one in Iowa, Senate File 542, that just allowed 14-year-olds, all these different changes, which we can talk about. That bill was passed at 4:52 in the morning in the legislature. So they were working deep into the night, making sure that, they waited till everybody was asleep and the media was not watching to pass this bill that will roll back child labor protections to the 1930s. So,
and just to push back a little bit on, because I feel like making the claim of the current evidence that we have is evidence of underreporting. I don't have anything specifically on that. I'm not sure if you do. So I don't want to necessarily go into that realm of, again, straw manning. I'll just say to that. But again, what we do have that we talked about earlier today was the effects that are leading, that we have the injury reports, and we do have some death reports. Similarly to, again, like migrants, a lot of the cases of companies looking the other way is more so like bringing your child to work day, because again, these are families that are typically lower income and needing to rely on it and not being able to have those levels of education. And this is also something that has been addressed by the White House more recently as a growing issue. And I think that to then have, the White House is saying this is an issue, and then the GOP to say, oh, well, we shouldn't have an issue and we should actually make it easier. That is where my bigger concerns are, and that's where I tried to stay a little bit more grounded. But
So let me talk about the bill a little bit. It in Iowa, because it would this is what is legally now allowed according to what the Senate passed there, which is that 14-year-olds can work 6-hour night shifts. 15-year-olds can perform light assembly work, whatever that means, moving items up to 50 pounds. 16 and 17-year-olds can serve alcohol if their parent or guardian signs a waiver. That to me was a very curious one, because I didn't know that there was such a desperate need for teenagers to be serving alcohol. But to me, I don't think about the risk of like the serving of the alcohol. To me, what would be the problem with that is, and because I work in the hospitality industry and I am around bartenders on a daily basis, I know that the biggest risk to a 16 or 17-year-old who's being asked to do that is not that they might consume alcohol. I think the risk is that they're going to be faced with a very aggressive or drunk customer who could wield a certain amount of power over them that they are not equipped to handle as a 16 or 17-year-old. And that's partly why the injury rates for child and youth workers are higher than they are for the general workforce, is because if they're generally inexperienced. And so, they're more likely to have a problem or not know how to respond to a situation. And so all of these things are very troubling, because, it's like, these are laws that were passed 80 to 100 years ago that are now being readdressed. That should tell us how dire the labor shortage is, or just how much legislatures are willing to sacrifice to make these employers happy.
And then, Braden, anything else that you want to add into the conversation?
Honestly, I feel like a lot of what had to be said has already been said, but I'm just going to say it once more. If you don't want to have to be in the position to hire children, then you should make your job a whole lot better. Okay, give your workers a salary increase, make sure the conditions aren't dangerous, make it a positive, happy, safe workplace, because guess what? Then you are going to get people who want to work for you. I mean, look, nobody in the United States wants to work. Like, nobody wakes up at 6 a.m. and thinks, oh God, I can't wait to go to work today and spend Monday through Friday there. But if you are able to create a workplace that is at least slightly positive, safe, and encouraging, then you aren't going to be in that issue where you're so desperate looking for new employees that you look towards children legally as young as 16, 15, 14, or illegally migrant children as young as 13 or 12.
And I just want to mention, because I know we talked about the evidence of the underreporting, another reason I cite that is because the child labor civil penalties that were paid out. This is from the Department of Labor. Child labor civil penalties that were paid out in fiscal year 2022. Only $4.3 million by employers were paid out in these civil penalties across the country for the entire year. And in the years before that, it had only been lower, like 1, 2, 3 million. That's a very, very low amount of money of penalties for the amount of child labor that's going on and for the vastness of the country. Like, if the penalties that are being paid are just a few $1 million for employers that are making billions and billions, that there's a lot more going on under the radar. And these federal agencies are so understaffed and so under-resourced, I think, that they don't have the ability to do all of the investigation that they should be doing, because maybe a Republican Congress took away all of the funding and they're down to a shoestring budget. So there is a lot more going on under the radar, I think, than anybody is really wants to admit. I think it's
yeah. And I also want to say, like, I agree that there's a very high likelihood of underreporting. I just wanted to kind of rein that in initially, without basically I when we make claims, I want to try to stay closer to, hey, here's what I'm having that I'm basing it off of. But yeah, anything else that you want to say as we wrap up?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about some of these other cases, but there's a lot that we could talk about. I know there was that. Did we address the McDonald's story of the 10-year-olds, or I guess we touched on it a little bit? But
yeah, so just a little bit more details on the McDonald's case. It was in a few franchises across the states in McDonald's, you had multiple cases of children that were working between the ages of 10 and 15. Again, with the most extreme example being someone that was working the deep fryer, which is already a more dangerous job, but the main thing being being a 10-year-old that was doing so. If you had more that you want to add on to that, you're more than
It
welcome.
said the story said that they were the children of a night manager who were like staying with them at work, I guess. And that these franchisees were having to pay a couple $100,000 in civil penalties for allowing the managers to bring their 10-year-old children to work. And you know, to me, that speaks to a deeper issue around, I think, labor in general in the country that is not necessarily just about children. I'm thinking about, I'm putting myself in the position of that night manager that might feel compelled to have their 10-year-old children with them at work because maybe the night manager at McDonald's doesn't make enough money for childcare for their kids to be anywhere else if they have to be at work until 2 a.m. And the fact that maybe that McDonald's is so understaffed that there's nobody else to help work the fry. All of these things are systemic problems with labor in the country that are so, that I don't necessarily fault a parent who's in a very difficult position. It's more about why is the restaurant not, covering the manager to make sure that they're not put in this position in the first place, and making sure that staff is adequate, making sure that childcare is a priority for children. These are all connected issues. And
yeah, and that is also something that the state, where when COVID happened, we passed the child tax credits. These child tax credits were thousands of dollars per child that were given out to families not only during the pandemic, but it was up to be voted on and continued to be passed going in the future. The existence of these child tax credits brought child poverty to the lowest that it had ever been. I believe the initial numbers, it went from 4.8 to 3.2%. The GOP, and I believe is the GOP plus Manchin, were the reason why we no longer have these child tax credits, and the reason why we have uplifted millions out of child poverty only to send them back down. And that, I think, is also a definite tragedy to have happened, but luckily is something that we as voters can continue to undo by advocating for this, at the very least, to be repealed back, to advocate for policies that make it so you don't need to go and work as someone, work in a dangerous industry if you are 15, 16, 17, to be able to have those safety nets for the people that are still growing in our nation.
And why don't you guys expand a little bit more? Because I know in the meeting we spoke about the fact that the more that kids like this are forced into these positions, the less time they have to focus on their education and the overall advancement of their future career. That's another thing that I think could be if you want to expand on that a little bit.
That's something that I touched on a little bit earlier. Again, with talking about me, where I did not have to work because I was in a very fortunate position during high school. But again, the things that you have to sacrifice for that, and it's not a surprise again, where if you do not have the same level of funds to be doing activities, to be able to have a childhood, to be able to socially develop and adapt, then that is going to be a moment of your life that, well, you started working and you start working and you continue working and you continue working and continue working. And just from a more moral societal standpoint, what good is GDP when your citizens are suffering on behalf of your productivity? And that is more the moralist on my end, in my perspective. But I, again, do not fault people that are in that very unfortunate position. So that's why I continue to advocate for policies that will decrease the likelihood of you having to make that impossible choice.
Well, Braden, maybe because I think you're the youngest here, you were in high school most recently, you might be able to speak on the educational gaps that occur when kids are put into this position. I mean, I certainly can remember it myself. Like I worked a little bit in high school, like I said, but not very much. I was not forced to be in a position where I had to think about having to go to work every day on top of my studies. And I think that's a very, very important distinction to make, because you sure, like, that you can make an argument that kids are going to get some valuable career experience out of some work, and maybe that's true, and maybe that's true for internships and things in the summer and some part-time work. But ultimately, like, at that age, and especially with the nature of education today, and I think how rigorous some courses are, especially if you're trying to take higher level courses and get into college, um, kids, if they're working all the time, are not going to have time to dedicate towards the studying that it really takes to succeed in those courses. I mean, it takes a lot of work. And so I don't know if, Braden, you want to expand on that a little bit from your experience. Or
Yeah, so as the youngest, thanks for getting out there. Makes me feel young again. I say that like I'm 80 years old. But I too was in a privileged position where, I mean, look, my family made enough. It was never a thing that where I had to go to work to help support my family. The reason I ended up getting a job in high school was just because I wanted some extra spending money for myself. And even then, I was very fortunate where I found some pretty amazing jobs where I would really just have to work like 5 hours almost entirely on the weekend. But I mean, yeah, I did a lot of APs in high school, actually, so much so that I'm skipping a year of college. And there is absolutely no way I could have done that if I was working every night of the week, or say 3 or 4 nights out of the week, because high school takes a lot out of you. It takes time out of your day. You also need time to rest and recover after that. You need time for self care to focus on yourself so you're not physically dying or mentally dying. And if you're throwing work on top of that, look, a few hours after school in a serving position, for example, like we were talking about, or bagging groceries, yeah, that's fine. That's not going to hurt you. That's not going to take too much away from you. But if you're losing sleep, if you're losing the ability to do homework and to study or to actually make it to school on time, that's when it creates that never ending cycle of poverty where, look, you were born in an unfortunate situation, so you had to go to work. You missed out on education, which prevented you from rising up. And now you're essentially doomed to a life of poverty, and your kids are going to be repeating that cycle. This is really the same issue that has been plaguing America throughout our nation's history. And I just want to say one thing that I feel like we kind of touch on with the child tax credit. One of the most effective, if not the most effective way to end child labor, besides actually enforcing the laws, would be universal child care, which sounds big, scary, and expensive, but it's a lot cheaper than it seems. And also, the results are going to pay for it multiple times over in the future. If you want to keep your kids safe, you invest in them.
yeah, agreed.
And I feel that's a pretty good way to end us off. So, any final closing thoughts? Are we good?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, then, thank you everyone for tuning in and listening today for our slightly shorter than usual episode. Next week, I will not be here, but we'll have Braden to speak a little bit on the crown, imperialism, and the other things that are happening in the UK/overseas in honor of our great monarch's crowning.
God save the king, or, maybe don't save him. I don't care.
God save the actually regicide. No, okay, we're fine. Yeah, and again, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.